She was a breath of fresh air, the Queen's beloved daughter-in-law, who was even trusted with the heirlooms of the crown. Today, she is losing her home and her last sanctuary in the royal world. How did this catastrophe happen? The story of her jewels, from a fiery ruby to stolen diamonds, will tell us everything about her dizzying rise and devastating fall. Before we begin, please support my channel by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons. Thank you. There is a house nestled in the heart of Windsor Great Park. It's called Royal Lodge. For more than 2 decades, it has been a sanctuary for Sarah, Duchess of York, a place of refuge and, in many ways, a symbol of her unique, enduring connection to the royal family, even long after her divorce. But today, that symbol is crumbling. The headlines are relentless, and in the wake of the renewed scandal surrounding Prince Andrew, the future of that home is deeply uncertain. It feels as though the final anchor holding her to the royal world is being weighed. It's a truly dramatic turn of events for a woman who once seemed to have it all. But to truly understand why the loss of this home feels like the final, painful chapter in such a complex story, we have to travel back in time. Back to a day when it seemed she had been given the keys to the entire kingdom, and the first key was a single, remarkable stone. Before the jewels, the tiaras, and the titles, there was just Sarah Ferguson, or Fergie, as the world would come to know her. When she entered the royal sphere, she was described as a complete breath of fresh air. Here was an adventurous contemporary woman with an independent outlook, whose natural spontaneity, enthusiasm, and easy laughter were unlike anything the public had seen from the Windsors in a very long time. But her vibrant personality and ideas didn't sit easily with the rigid protocol of royal life. And isn't that just the most fascinating paradox? She was adored for being herself, and for that very same reason, she was relentlessly criticized. This strange duality, this push and pull between who she was and who she was expected to be, would shadow her for the rest of her life. And it began, as so many royal stories do, with the presentation of her very first royal jewel. When Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson announced their engagement on March 16, 1986, all eyes naturally went straight to the ring. And what a ring it was! It bore a passing resemblance to the famous sapphire worn by her sister-in-law, Diana, Princess of Wales, but it was entirely its own creation. At its heart was a magnificent Burmese ruby, a deep glowing red encircled by 10 brilliant diamonds. The stones were set in a flower pattern, a design known as a cluster ring, all resting on a warm yellow gold band. The ring was crafted by the esteemed British jewelry house, Gerard, the very same jewelers responsible for Diana's iconic sapphire piece, and later, Sophie Wessex's engagement ring. So, it had the royal pedigree, the stamp of tradition. Yet, from the very beginning, this ring was telling a different story. During their official engagement interview, Prince Andrew explained that the choice of a ruby was a mutual conclusion, because red was simply the best color for Sarah. But it was the design, those extra bits on the outside, as he so charmingly put it, that spoke to their shared desire for something wonderfully unconventional. They didn't want a classic solitaire or a predictable design. They wanted something that reflected her. And that brings us to the most romantic part of this story. The decision to use a Burmese ruby wasn't just about color theory. Andrew specifically chose that fiery, vibrant stone to match Sarah's magnificent red hair. Now, while everyone at the time couldn't help but compare her ring to Diana's, Sarah's was a much more personal statement. It wasn't selected from a tray. It was conceived and designed with her essence in mind. It was a tribute to the very thing that made her stand out. But I wonder, did she have any idea then that she would have to defend that very fire, that vibrant spirit, for the rest of her life? Their story had begun just the year before, in 1985, reportedly thanks to a bit of matchmaking by Diana, Princess of Wales, herself. The Queen had invited Sarah to an event at Windsor Castle during Ascot Week, and she happened to be seated right across from the prince. By February of 1986, they were engaged. Andrew proposed at Scotland's Floors Castle, choosing the exact spot where the couple had shared their very first kiss. It all sounds like a perfect fairy tale, doesn't it? The ring itself, at the time, was reported to have cost around £25,000. It was a symbol of this whirlwind romance, a promise of a new life within the most famous family in the world. And it was just the beginning. The world had seen the ring that sealed the engagement, but an even more spectacular jewel was waiting in the wings, one that would mark her official transformation from commoner to duchess, right before the eyes of the entire world. And so, on that bright July day in 1986, the world tuned in to watch the second great royal wedding of the decade. As Sarah Ferguson stepped out of her carriage at Westminster Abbey, there was a collective gasp and perhaps a moment of confusion. Most royal brides arrive crowned with a family tiara, a sparkling heirloom connecting them to generations past. But Sarah arrived wearing a magnificent, almost bohemian crown of flowers, a cascade of fragrant gardenias that sat atop her veil. For a moment, people might have wondered if she was breaking with tradition entirely. But this was no oversight. It was a carefully considered, deeply symbolic gesture. You see, she had her tiara with her, hidden perfectly beneath that floral wreath. The plan, as we now know, was deliberate. She wanted to walk up that long aisle as Sarah Ferguson, a commoner, and emerge as Her Royal Highness the Duchess of York. The actual transformation happened away from the prying eyes of the television cameras. After the vows were exchanged, the new Duke and Duchess of York stepped away to sign the official wedding register. And in that quiet, private moment, the flowers were removed. When she stepped back into the light, riding in the carriage through the cheering crowds of London, she was no longer wearing the floral crown. In its place was a brand new, glittering diamond scroll tiara. I find this so incredibly telling about her character. It shows a woman who wasn't just passively entering an institution. She was actively shaping her own narrative within it. It was a piece of pure, brilliant theater, a visual representation of her metamorphosis played out for the entire world. But the most interesting thing about this tiara is not how it appeared in public, but where it came from. And that small detail reveals an incredible level of trust and personal affection placed in her by the Queen herself. You see, unlike so many royal brides who wear tiaras loaned from the vast royal collection, Sarah's was brand new. It was purchased for her, a personal wedding gift from none other than Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip from the House of Gerard. Now, there is a little bit of that classic palace mystery surrounding the exact circumstances of the purchase. On the wedding day itself, the official comment was that the tiara had been lent by a family friend. Some have wondered if this was perhaps just palace code, and the anonymous friend was really her new and very famous in-laws. We may never know the precise details of how the transaction was arranged. But what we do know, and what is far more important, is that after that day, the tiara was hers. And this gesture, this incredible gift, speaks volumes about the warmth of Sarah's initial reception into the royal family. The sources from that time paint a very clear picture. The Queen was genuinely fond of her new daughter-in-law. She immediately began referring to Sarah as "my daughter." And the Queen Mother, a formidable judge of character, reportedly summed her up by saying, "She's so English, so free of all those airs and graces we can't stand." They shared a genuine bond, particularly over their mutual love of horses, polo, and all things related to country life. They were often seen together at equestrian events, and the relationship was said to be very relaxed. They were, in many ways, two of a kind, practical, outdoor-loving women who enjoyed a good laugh. So, when you look at that beautiful diamond tiara, you're not just seeing a wedding jewel, you're seeing a tangible symbol of that affection, a vote of absolute confidence from the monarch herself. To receive such a personal, significant gift from the Queen is an incredible honor, a sign that you are not just being welcomed, but truly embraced. Of course, that spectacular tiara was a statement, but it didn't stand alone. To mark the wedding, the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh also presented their new daughter-in-law with an entire suite of diamonds, also from Gerard. It's what's known as a demi-parure, a magnificent matching set consisting of a modern diamond necklace, a bracelet, and a pair of earrings. This wasn't just another wedding gift. This was, in essence, her ducal uniform. It's one thing to have a breathtaking tiara for the grandest occasions, but this diamond suite became the workhorse of her royal wardrobe. It was the set she wore when she was on duty, representing the family and the crown at countless galas, concerts, and state dinners. And she began wearing it almost immediately. She wore the suite for numerous high-profile events right after her wedding, including the Royal Variety performance later that year. When she and Andrew embarked on their hugely successful royal tour of Canada in 1987, the full parure was on dazzling display, often paired with her York diamond tiara. What I find so lovely is seeing how she wore these pieces. At a state banquet, she was the picture of regal elegance. But then you'll see photos from other events, like a return banquet for the Saudi royal family in 1988, where she showed a flash of that creative, slightly unconventional style that people so admired. In a wonderfully fashionable move, she had the diamond bracelet threaded through her hair. It's a small detail, I know, but it says so much about her personality. She was a royal, yes, but she was always unapologetically Sarah. Just look at these photographs from that time. She is confident, radiant, and absolutely glittering in diamonds personally gifted to her by the Queen. She looks every inch the Grand Duchess, as though she was born to play this part. But the Queen's gestures of support weren't over. In fact, her most profound one was still to come. But we'll return to that in just a moment, because first, we need to talk about another spectacular suite of jewels that cemented Sarah's new international status. Her new status as a duchess wasn't just recognized within Britain. She was now a major figure on the world stage, and this was reflected in the lavish gifts she began to receive. In 1986, she was given a spectacular ruby and diamond suite by the Saudi royal family. It featured a striking, almost serpent-like necklace and coordinating earrings. Now, this is a really interesting point. Her sister-in-law, Diana, Princess of Wales, had famously received her own magnificent suite of sapphires from the same royal family. So this gift was highly symbolic. It placed the new duchess on a similar level, a recipient of the same grand international gestures. Sarah wore the suite with her tiara during that first official tour of Canada in 1987, cementing her image as a glamorous new addition to the royal circuit. But interestingly, unlike her tiara and diamond parure, the ruby suite seems to have vanished from public view for decades. It's one of those quiet little mysteries in her collection. But for all the spectacular international gifts, the most profound sign of her acceptance came not from a foreign prince, but from her own mother-in-law. Receiving a personal tiara and a diamond suite from the Queen is one thing, but what happened next was on an entirely different level. It was a gesture that moved beyond personal affection and into the realm of profound institutional trust. To understand it, we need to talk about a very special and very important set of jewels, Queen Victoria's bow brooches. These are not just any brooches. After losing a number of family heirlooms in a legal dispute in 1858, Queen Victoria commissioned 3 magnificent diamond bow brooches from Gerard, using over 500 diamonds from her own collection. But their true significance lies in what she did next. Upon her death, Queen Victoria designated these brooches as heirlooms of the crown. Now that is a critically important term. It means these jewels do not belong to an individual, not even the monarch herself. They belong to the crown as an institution, passing directly from one sovereign to the next, specifically, as the decree states, to be worn by future queens. And they were. Queen Alexandra wore them, Queen Mary wore them in countless creative ways, the Queen Mother favored a single one on her shoulder, and of course, Queen Elizabeth II wore them frequently and for some of her most significant appearances. And then, in 1986, something extraordinary happened. At the Braemar Games in Scotland, the Queen made what the royal record describes as a very unusual gesture. She loaned one of these historic bow brooches to the newlywed Duchess of York. We know that Sarah is a well-known admirer of Queen Victoria, so perhaps this was a particularly thoughtful personal nod from her new mother-in-law. But let's just pause and think about the significance of this. It was an unprecedented sign of trust. A jewel that had been passed from queen to queen, from Alexandra to Mary to Elizabeth, was suddenly seen sparkling at the collar of a duchess who hadn't even been in the family for a full year. It seemed to say one thing, loud and clear. In the Queen's eyes, Sarah was the perfect duchess. She could do no wrong. But, as we all know, perfect images are often the most fragile. The reality of being a naval wife soon began to take its toll. Prince Andrew was often away for months, and Sarah, still finding her footing, faced a hostile press on one side and a rigid royal system on the other. She had once earned her own living, yet as a duchess she suddenly found herself with little personal income. The tabloids called her extravagant, but in truth, she could barely afford lunch with friends. It was an isolating contradiction, a life of crowns and titles, but no independence. Loneliness crept in, and the marriage began to falter. Her affairs with men like Texan Steve Wyatt and her financial advisor John Bryan only hastened the collapse. Sarah's own missteps were widely publicized, but Andrew's record was hardly spotless. His fondness for nightlife and a lingering reputation from his Playboy Prince years did little to help the fragile union. By 1992, they had formally separated, marking the beginning of one of the most unconventional post-divorce relationships the royal family had ever seen. The scandal hit the monarchy hard. Prince Philip was reportedly furious, and Sarah was quietly frozen out of official life. Between the separation and their 1996 divorce, she lived in a strange royal limbo, still a duchess but adrift. Financial pressures mounted, and the old palace schedule that once guided her days was gone. Then, in 1995, came a bizarre episode that perfectly captured how far she had fallen from the fairy tale. The year was 1995. Sarah was traveling back to London from JFK Airport in New York, and in a moment of what can only be described as chaotic oversight, a case containing her Garrard diamond suite, the necklace and bracelet, together worth an estimated $500,000, was mistakenly placed into her checked luggage. The Duchess would later claim it was her lady-in-waiting who made the error, but regardless of whose hands were responsible, the result was a catastrophe waiting to happen. And happen it did. The suitcase was spotted by a teenage baggage handler, who, upon opening it and finding the dazzling jewels, later told authorities with incredible understatement, "I figured it was worth something." What followed was a full-blown FBI investigation, and the details of where they found these royal treasures are just almost hard to believe. The bracelet was recovered at the airport, but the necklace, or what was left of it after the thief had reportedly started prying stones from it, was discovered stashed away in a locker and in a tool shed behind the handler's house. After the jewels were finally returned to the Duchess, the assistant director of the FBI was questioned about the wisdom of traveling with such valuables in that manner. His response was wonderfully, brutally honest. He said, "I don't think it shows a lot of wisdom myself. I certainly wouldn't do it, but I personally wouldn't have $500,000 of jewelry." And he was right, of course. Just think about it for a moment. Diamonds, personally gifted by the Queen of England, that had sparkled at state banquets and on royal tours around the world, were found stashed in a tool shed in Queens. If ever there was a metaphor for how quickly Sarah's royal fairy tale was turning into a tangled, chaotic thriller, this was it. After the divorce in 1996, something highly unusual happened. Sarah and Andrew remained exceptionally close. So close, in fact, that since 2008, they have lived together at Royal Lodge. For years, this arrangement fueled speculation. Some saw it as a beautiful example of a modern, blended family, a sign of their enduring friendship that might even lead to a remarriage. But as the years went on and scandals mounted, a much more cynical view began to take hold. People started to see it as a freeloading arrangement, asking a very pointed question. Why was an ex-wife, divorced for decades, still living in a grand royal residence? There was a growing suspicion that it was a pact of mutual convenience, or perhaps mutual silence. To many, it seemed the two were as thick as thieves, bound together by the secrets of their past. This unconventional setup would become one of the defining and most criticized aspects of her post-royal life. And yet, despite being officially excluded from major public events, a surprising, private connection with the Queen endured. Sources from the time note that the Queen continued to invite Sarah to private family gatherings at Balmoral and Sandringham. It was a delicate balance. The monarch had to publicly distance the institution from scandal, but the grandmother and mother-in-law seemed to quietly keep the door open. After the divorce in 1996, the world watched and wondered, what would become of Sarah? And for us jewelry lovers, a more specific question lingered. What would become of the York diamond tiara? It was a gift, not a loan, and so the tiara remained her personal property. For years, however, it seemed to be collecting dust in a jewelry safe somewhere. The grand state banquets and official tours were a thing of the past. It felt as though its chapter in royal history was closed. And then, in 2001, it reappeared. But the setting could not have been more different. It wasn't a palace or a state opening of Parliament. The York diamond tiara made its grand return at Elton John's annual white tie and tiara ball, one of the most glamorous and celebrity-filled charity events in the world. Sarah was there, looking wonderful, with the diamond scrolls glittering in her famous red hair once again, and it seems to me that moment is so incredibly telling. The tiara was no longer a symbol of her official role within the monarchy. It had transformed just as she had. Now it was the accessory of a global celebrity, a spectacular, sparkling reminder of her past, helping her to navigate a brand new, non-royal world. But while the tiara was a link to her past, Sarah had to build a future that, for the first time in a decade, required her to earn a living. And in 2006, she made a move that was as pragmatic as it was surprising. She went into the jewelry business herself. In collaboration with a company called K&G Creations, she launched two distinct lines. One was a fashion-forward collection, and the other a larger, one-of-a-kind assortment. The pieces were sold in major American department stores like Macy's and Lord & Taylor, featuring gold, pearls, and colored quartz. But the collection also featured a very unexpected material, moissanite, a colorless crystal, first discovered in a meteor that serves as a beautiful and affordable alternative to diamonds. When asked about this choice, Sarah said, "A lot of people say, 'Why would you do moissanite?' And I do it because I think you can wear beautiful things and give people a chance to afford them. That's why I like it. Everyone would expect you to do diamonds." The royalties from the line went to the Sarah Ferguson Foundation, supporting children's charities, which added another layer of purpose to the venture. It was the story of her survival, a pivot from receiving priceless jewels to creating affordable ones, all while trying to do some good in the world. And for a long time, it seemed that this was the final chapter in her jewelry story. The tiara's public life was over, a memory of a past life. But what of her most significant jewel, the one that had marked her grand entrance into the royal world? After that night at Elton John's ball, the York diamond tiara once again retreated into silence. For more than 20 years, it remained unseen, its fate a quiet mystery among royal watchers. We all wondered if we would ever see it again. It wasn't worn by either Princess Beatrice or Princess Eugenie for their own weddings, fueling widespread speculation that it had been quietly sold. And then, in June of 2023, came the spectacular royal wedding of Crown Prince Hussein and Princess Rajwa of Jordan. The world's royals gathered in Amman for a magnificent banquet at the Al Husseiniya Palace, a glittering sea of gowns and historic jewels. Representing the York family was Princess Beatrice, and as she entered the room, there was a collective, joyful intake of breath from everyone who loves these pieces and their stories, because there, sparkling in her hair, was the York diamond tiara. It was a truly breathtaking moment. The tiara, which had been her mother's wedding crown, her symbol of becoming a duchess, was finally seeing the light of day once more. It was the first time Beatrice had ever worn it, and the significance was just so incredibly moving. While her daughter carried the family sparkle into the future, Sarah's own world was beginning to darken once again. The past she had tried so hard to outshine was slowly catching up with her. For years, Sarah worked to distance herself from disgraced financier Jeffrey Epstein, calling her decision to accept money from him a gigantic error of judgment. She recast herself as a philanthropist and advocate for trafficking victims. But in late 2025, an old email surfaced, and it was devastating. Written just weeks after her apology, it addressed Epstein as her supreme and steadfast friend, and appeared to regret her public criticism. The backlash was swift. The goodwill she had spent years rebuilding vanished almost overnight as charities and media partners cut ties. The woman once seen as flawed but redeemable was now viewed as irreparably compromised, her image bound once more to Andrew and to scandal. And so our story returns to where it began, the gates of Royal Lodge. She still has the jewels, the fiery ruby engagement ring, a promise of an unconventional fairy tale, the diamond demi-parure, a queen's gift that survived its own brush with crime, and of course, the magnificent York diamond tiara. These are the tangible artifacts of her royal story, glittering reminders of the immense promise and affection that once surrounded her. But the house, the last physical piece of that royal world, is now gone. What strikes me most when looking at the whole picture is the profound gap between the two. On one hand, you have these gestures of incredible trust, a personal tiara, the loan of a queen's heirloom. On the other, a pattern of disastrous choices, financial chaos, and a final, unforgivable email. It leaves us with a story not just of contrasts, but of consequences. A story that asks a difficult question. What happens when you are given all the symbols of belonging, but ultimately prove unable to live up to them? It's a complex legacy, and one that offers no simple answers. If you enjoyed uncovering this story with me, please give this video a like and subscribe for more histories from the Royal Vaults. Thank you so much for watching.